Welcome back, everyone. Thank you, guys. I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I had a pretty good day. Oldest daughter helped out with food. As you can tell, though, I am getting a bit of a cold, which is not so awesome. But it's probably God telling me to stop talking so daggone much. Let's see. Welcome, Penny Williams and Christine and Alice G. Jen Devka. Welcome, welcome. M169, welcome. Tammy Bogard and a dog named Boo. And Mucky Mole, welcome. So, I did this a little different. I decided to write this out, kind of my more long thoughts, and double space it so I can actually read what I'm looking at. I have 33 pages of notes with you guys, or to go over with you guys, especially about this second episode. So we left off on a cliffhanger. We got the DNA back, but at the time of the last episode, only the CBI, the Colorado Bureau of Investigators, had the full extent of the DNA information that was taken off of JonBenet's body. This episode is called Episode 2, Umbrella of Suspicion. And about halfway through this episode, you will realize that we not only do not hate the media enough, but we do not dislike Colorado police enough. Because this is wild. This is stuff I never knew about when I was 12 years old. But let's get going. So we start out with just a montage of trash media. We have Geraldo Rivera, which, ew, sir, no one wants to see you on Instagram shirtless. This is cruel and unusual punishment for those of us who did not know that we'd be seeing a shirtless Geraldo anywhere. But you have all of the, as much as I went into this, docuseries thinking the media has just gone crazy. Oh no, we're about to go into how bad the media was back when I wasn't paying attention to it. So we start off with some of this archival video footage that we have of Patsy Ramsey, and you will come to find out why all of the interviews, these archival videos of Patsy and John, look the same. They are from, I believe, the producer of this documentary, but a University of Boulder professor who was very interested in how the media had journalistic ethics on these sort of bigger cases. So we start with Patsy just kind of full, she looks like she's pretty made up. You can tell it's fairly recently, but not where she was going downhill right prior to her death. And she talks about, just kind of trying to avoid time. And she puts up Geraldo Rivera. Now, I didn't remember this because Geraldo was never my jam. I was always a Sally, Jesse, Raphael kind of gal. But apparently, Geraldo Rivera, not to be outdone with smarmy and ridiculous things such as never finding Hoffa, decided to do a mock trial of the Ramseys on his talk show. So we get to see a bunch of these non-affiliated people. I guess it was a whole thing. He did a mock trial. And the Ramseys were found liable for JonBenet being sexualized and possibly being put in front of a predator. Now, it goes to, and when I say you do not hate experts and media people who have experts on their shows, we get to see this cute little video from December 22nd, 1996, the year she passed away. She was performing maybe like a senior show somewhere in a mall somewhere. And now I don't have any dance skills. So, but basically, JonBenet has a saxophone and she's doing one of these things. Now, if you've ever seen little kids dance, they kind of do an up and down thing. Well, this expert with a straight face in her most Helen Lovejoy, won't someone think of the children, talks about how JonBenet, not, playing a pretend saxophone to rocking around the Christmas tree. No, she wasn't doing that. No, this was a cry for help, y'all. JonBenet was signaling that she was master self-loving herself. She was mimicking that with the saxophone. You know how every little kid, if you gave a little kid like, hey, pretend you're playing the saxophone, and they do one of this thing? That's what JonBenet was doing. Now, she makes the most disgusting on-air, against the Goldwater, decision sort of diagnosis as this being this little girl, acting out her overly sexualized behavior, not playing a pretend saxophone. No, she's like, and I know they're guilty because she was there for 2 minutes masturbating with the saxophone. So not only does this woman not know JonBenet, but wants to put out and make salacious something that my son would probably still do if I said, pretend you're playing a saxophone. So you guys will get... I found myself having to take little breaks because I got more and more upset. It's ridiculous. So she claims this is her only evidence. She doesn't know the Ramseys. She never talked to anyone. She never talked to John. She never talked to Patsy. No, this is how she knows that this child was, of course, absolutely hypersexualized. She claimed that this was, of course, down to the bone evidence that her taking the saxophone back and forth was obviously a cry for help. Obvious sarcasm is obvious. We cut back to Patsy. I mean, the look on Patsy's face was one of just stark horror. She's, kind of saying, these people don't know me, and yet they're giving me, accusations that my daughter is sexualized, taking the way that she plays with a mock saxophone as to, just clear, delineated evidence that this is, of course, the case. And none of these experts, none of the panel or Geraldo studio audience that decided that the Ramseys were guilty, none of that. This was all playing out on national television, and the media and the police had decided the Ramseys were guilty, and they were going to keep that alive, because the police were kind of in this funny spot where, as you'll find out later in this episode, they don't have a lot. The Ramseys aren't talking to them. They got lawyers because, as all of us who watch LawTube know, you do not talk to the police without lawyers. So Geraldo claimed that, this court case, this mock trial was only, to try to get answers for what happened to JonBenet. And Patsy, there was no way you could look at the evidence. Every single part of the evidence, according to Geraldo, led to this conclusion. The parents did it, or they let a gross kid person here, and that's, some way, no matter how you slice it, this was the Ramseys' fault. And we kind of cut from that, and then we go to family videos of Burke and JonBenet. And Burke seems like a chatty little boy. JonBenet looks like she's just, again, interacting with family. And we cut back to the media, again, reminding everyone that, no one has been under the cloud or taken out of the, umbrella of suspicion. We are all very, very worried. Basically, everyone knew the answer to this. It might have been unsolved right now, but we all knew somehow the Ramseys were going to get there. And Thank you so much, Kelly, for the surprised hippopotamus. Thank you so much. So we get introduced now to two lead detectives. So we get introduced to Tom Trujillo and Steve Thomas. Now keep Steve in your mind. Steve Thomas is going to be a very important person in this episode because he got deposed a couple years after the unaliving, and it's not going to go well for the Boulder police or Mr. Steve Thomas. Now we cut to Pam Woodward. Now Pam Woodward, if you remember, was one of the media people that we were kind of introduced to, talking about Steve, how he had a lot of police experience. You know, he was from the narcotics unit. Do you want to know the one thing he didn't have experience in? Not one bit. Homicide. No, he had never worked one homicide, but they were going to make him the lead detective with Tom Trujillo of this particular crazy case. But she does say that he was passionate and he, just wanted to find the unaliver. Carol McKinney is more kind of like a character evidence stating that, he wanted to close this case, things like that. He was really motivated. The head of the department stated that he thought that these two detectives without homicide experience were going to be great. This is all going to work out for the best. Now, this is Detective Whitting, and we met him in the last episode. And he was kind of on the Ramseys are there. Basically, he's like, before I left, and retired from the police department, I left him in this case in their capable hands. But then you start to hear him say something else. He states that there was some information about the case that he didn't learn until he had actually retired from the police department, and he found out all of this information after he left, and it made him question, for the first time since he was introduced to the case, whether the Ramseys did it or not. He talks about a civil lawsuit, so interspersed through all of this case, we are being led along this deposition because it turns out that there might have been a little buddy-buddiness between the media and the police department. And we talk about how the Ramseys bought a civil case against, the police department. And, well, old Detective Steve, he got deposed and, well, he really should have asked that they not record these things. If you would, he really wishes that he probably hadn't, put on such a poor performance. Now, the lawyer for the Ramseys asks Detective Steve Thomas if there was a plan from the Boulder Police Department to release little snippets, little crumb drops in the media that said that the Ramseys were involved. Nothing official, just like sources close to, like, hey, come on, let me tell you a story. Okay, that kind of thing. And Detective Steve is like, well, yeah, there were discussions with the FBI to put some more pressure on the Ramseys. They weren't talking with us. We couldn't get them to answer our questions. So they were hoping that adding and sprinkling little crumbs and putting pressure on the Ramseys would lead to them confessing or for them to do, something, kind of implicate themselves. Now, he does state that there was some motivation toward that end, but he stops each time and has to think deeply about what the hell his lawyer told him not to effing say. You can see it. You can see where he's like, okay, if I was innocent, I'd say, yeah, we did that. That's normal standard operating procedure. But my lawyer said, do not be a dumbass. What did lawyer say? Sort of? Maybe? So you can tell that the lawyer has struck upon a little bit of a sore spot because he's definitely having to think about what his lawyer said. Look, we will get our asses sued off. You will not say this. Now, he doesn't agree on any of these premises, like, were you trying to smoke out the Ramseys? Were you trying to get people to confess? Were you trying to do anything? He doesn't say, yes, we were. He just was like, we released stuff to the media, and if whatever happened, happened. He was this early before YOLO. He was like, so these are depositions taken in the civil case, you know, basically stating that the Boulder Police Department was involved in a conspiracy to railroad their client. And again, I say we do not hate the media nearly enough. Geraldo, the weirdo 60-year-old man who should not be putting up shirtless pictures on Instagram, and I will never, you know what, Geraldo, just for you tonight, I'm going to rewatch When You Didn't Find Hoffa and laugh my ever-living boobs off. Now, John comes in and kind of basically states that the police strategy was to sweat the Ramseys out, basically put out all these stories that the walls are closing in, the sun is setting on the Ramseys' freedom, we are going to smoke them out. And then we meet a producer for this documentary, Professor Michael Tracy, a professor at the University of Boulder, who basically does critiques on the sort of cultural landscape that journalism had become at that time. Little did he know that it's going to be a bunch and 12 billion times worse now. Just ask Karen Reed. But he basically introduces just himself, and he has a lovely British or possibly Australian accent. He just kind of introduces himself as someone from the university, and he in fact was the creator of the first documentary ever produced about JonBenet Ramsey. Now, the first story that we get a little bit of an idea, might have had a little police sprinkles razzle dazzle in it, is the no footprints in the snow. If you were around during this time, you remember this. Police are suspicious because they saw no intruder footsteps in the snow. And we get to see a kind of montage of every single outlet, inlet, and, everywhere doing variations of there were no footprints in the snow, therefore that's how we know an outside person didn't do it. However, darn it, if you look at pictures, there was a very light dusting of snow, but absolutely not enough that you would be able to even distinguish footprints. So the fact that they didn't find footprints wasn't, evidence of lack. It was because you wouldn't have found footprints to begin with. And that just happened to be a little sprinkle that went to a couple of choice media clients, sources that the police have. And we learned that one of the journalists that the police handpicked to, super secret special friend, confess to, was Charlie Brennan. Now, Charlie Brennan does give a voiceover stating that he was given information from a trusted media source. I'm hoping that they were wearing a trench coat and made him call him Deep Throat at this point. But, it wasn't me, Charlie Brennan. And yes, he does refer to himself in the third person, is in an utterly insufferable and ridiculous way. But he's like, it wasn't me, Charlie Brennan, saying these. It was a close, trusted source in the media. And so that's kind of how he divorces himself from his responsibility when you see that, he was taking stories that the media fed him, or not the media, that the police fed him, and giving it to, everyone else basically saying, like, a source close to, they're closing in, the Ramseys are going to be indicted tomorrow. So he states that, while he didn't have any opinions on this, he was told by a very close source that, the lack of footprints was interesting. Charlie Brennan distanced himself from this false flag story by stating, hey, it's not my job to decide what the police are thinking. I'm just supposed to be getting information out there. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people in 1930s said they were just following orders too, sir. So we can definitely start to see that this new sort of phenomenon of the cops and media, local insiders kind of working out to get these stories out doesn't seem to, be a new thing. This seems to have been alive and well even in the early 90s. Now, he does state that, police latched onto this key information and they started to see newspaper reporting about a lot of leaks. So not only are you having the newspaper put out handpicked stories, to try to sweat out the Ramseys, but we're also getting stories that there are a bunch of leaks. So plausible deniabilities on both ends, We have a leak problem. We're working on it. The plumber's back here. And then it's not what Charlie, Brennan thought. It was what the police thought was important. And I'm just being a journalist giving out the news. Okay, Sarah Boone. Nice try. Now, another one of their hand-picked little toadies happened to be a journalist that we had already talked to or learned about, earlier, and that was Julia McKinley. Now, apparently she was from a local Boulder police or Boulder kind of news organization, newspaper, and she said, well, look, you know what? Technically, you're supposed to have two sources, for whatever you put out. But I trust these people and, maybe I just didn't look at all the sources, I mean, it's my bad, but what you're going to do? So you do get kind of, they're all starting to tell on each other. So, yeah. Then, Julie's like, there are a lot of false statements made about evidence in the case that was leaked to a chosen few to get these sensational stories out. They like the first one, the no footprints. I mean, she's like, how can I go verify that? I mean, I don't have shoes and I don't have snow. I mean, it was in a police report, so I just run with it. She does state that she doesn't take what the police say as gospel, but then again, there's distancing language that, chucks that, oh shucks, what was I supposed to do about that, kind of thing. And she does state that the Ramseys weren't talking, so it clearly seems suspicious, and, journalist is gonna journalist. That's basically what she said. Now, what are you going to do? Because journalists stand for America, babies and Fazoli's, and we're going to stand for what's right. Or something or other, altogether self-righteous and self-aggrandizing. We are the voice of the truth. We are the voice of the people, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, we also took planted stories from the police. So then the next story that we're given as an example of, some of the things that were planted was this big story that came out that John Ramsey has his pilot's license. Basically, he flew his own private jet with his daughter's body back down to Alabama. Now, the problem with that would be, and it was everywhere. I mean, they showed montages of just, so what kind of father could fly his own daughter back for a funeral? I mean, just what kind of ice cold blooded monster? I mean, this is basically what you've got. And that would have been a really, really great story. It definitely questioned whether this man was so grief stricken that he could not function, not talk to the police. Because, I mean, obviously, if you have a missing child or you have a dead child, you'd want to work with the police. No, they have not. But there are a lot of questions going on in every nightly news and the rags and all of this other stuff that how could this father fly his daughter back to for a funeral? And you kind of wonder why. Yeah. The only thing about that is that John Ramsey didn't have his own personal jet and he didn't fly his jet. This story again came from Charlie Brennan, who got a special super secret, like, little text message from the cops that this was totally something that they were suspicious and worried about. Now, Mr. Brennan magnanimously and with great humility admits that he might have gotten things wrong on this case. Now, Paula Woodward comes in to remind the viewer that, something is very important to remember about all of this dishonesty about what's being leaked on, by the media and everything else. And that's that while the police are just, sprinkling these little seeds of deception and perception and suspicion, what's the one thing they haven't leaked out? What's the one thing they haven't gotten around to telling anybody about? Oh, those would be those DNA tests that they did from the DNA from the fingernails in the private area of JonBenet Ramsey. Well, that got back and no one said anything about it. Not the cops. Hell, the cops weren't even telling the DA what was going on. DNA results often linked to suspects in the case, but it was the one piece of evidence that could clearly put the Ramseys dead to rights in the El Suspecto lineup, or it could alleviate them from that. And, then we get media talking about how defense attorneys, stop the Ramseys from talking to the media. We get to see the media basically camped out in front of anywhere that the Ramseys were staying, if they went to the store, if they went down this area, they were completely mobbed by by just everyone in media. Everyone wanted to get that first interview, first talk with these parents that everyone totally for serial knew did this. Now, I did end the last episode by stating that I didn't feel like the episode was leading you to think a certain thought. This episode, that changes. You are shown how incredibly dishonest and corrupt the media is, how they worked with the police to put out narratives that weren't ever found to be true. And you're definitely, at this point, this episode is putting a lot of holes in the police theory. Now, we did get the media talking about, handwriting experts, the ransom notes, all of these. Bob Whitten, the detective that retired and eventually went on to find a lot of evidence he wasn't being shown while he was in the police department, states that at least experts, out of 4 experts, at least 2 of them thought that Patsy Ramsey could be the author of the ransom note. Now, Detective Steve, we go back to the deposition, and he is asked if Patsy Ramsey's handwriting matches the handwriting on the ransom note and whether that was the expert's opinion. And he states that all experts did agree. Then we get some more media talking about, the notes. We've got all the experts coming on. That's totally her pee. This is totally not her pee. And it was really interesting. And then you get Pamela Woodward, a media personality, comes in and says that it turns out that the amount that they asked for in the ransom was similar to a bonus that John Ramsey had gotten that particular year. So and then that was also, again, leaked to the media. Basically, police say that is super suspiciosus, that, Ramses wrote this note. And I will say, up at this point of the episode, I'm wondering if the producers want me to fight or start finding reasonable doubt for the parents. Now we are offering, police testimony saying that some of this is sort of right. So it is at my point at this point in the episode, I was thinking, okay, are we starting to, try to put holes in the Ramses theory by kind of showing the things that, if you've looked at this case, that ransom note is insanity. And the random amount, are we trying to start feeling like, okay, well, the police aren't acting with the greatest amount of integrity, but they have all these facts lining up and they can't get to the Ramses. So what am I supposed to think now? Because I'm always looking at, what do the producers want me to start thinking, especially with documentaries. So, do you need to talk to your trusted reporter friends? Can you just give perfectly shaded data? And it really brought me to some of the other cases that I've seen here lately. So the Delphi case, the Karen Reed case, we have all of these cases, the Jose Ibarra case. I mean, we have cases that are just as then, now today, that are being tried in the court of public opinion. So it really does get kind of muddled where I think this show is wanting me to go. Now, the police didn't let the evidence lead them to what they thought. They had already come up with they already had sights on the Ramses from day one. Now, that was kind of my opinion as to where we were going with this. But then you've got Bob Whitson, the head of the police, cuts in and states that, there's another possibility here. And it's the first time that this is introduced as even a concept or a theory. But if someone had broken into the home and the Ramses were out that night having friends, I think having dinner with friends, and were out until 9, if someone had gotten in the house during that time, had plenty of time to get themselves kind of secreted within the house and were able to go through documents in the house, apparently John Ramsey's bonus information was kind of right on papers on top of his desk. So it does start to introduce this theory that maybe someone came in and they never left. So we do kind of get that going in. It's an interesting theory, but this is kind of just my thoughts. It's an interesting theory, but until you show me proof, and I guess we have proof with the foreign DNA, but with outrageous claims comes the need for outrageous evidence to prove your claims. We once again cut into the media barrage of just the Ramses driving around. Patsy continually kind of wore a jacket over her head. So you see how just the media is trying to disrupt the life of this family, and how invasive and intrusive they were to every part of this family, not letting them grieve, almost deciding that this family didn't deserve to grieve. I mean, if you want to talk about the really kind of very moralistic and judgmental way that the Ramses were talked about, it's almost like the media had decided this family, they're wrong for whatever reason. And I may not have evidence, but there's something I can figure they're wrong, and they don't get to grieve this little girl. It was a very much like, we're going to hassle you until we get the answers we want. Tense and sinister music, and then Carol McKinney comes back. Now, Carol was part of the little groupie group of besties with the cops who, stated that outright many of the locals did not trust John Ramsey, did not trust the Ramsey at all. They were totally guilty. John Ramsey had essayed his own daughter. We all knew it, that he was creepy. He put her in, those gross pageants. We knew. Now, you probably have heard a lot about this one, but there was a story leaked about possible chronic and habitual SA of JonBenet. That was, part of what was put into the autopsy. And journalists ran with this. And it wasn't until Paula Woodward did an interview with JonBenet Ramsey's pediatrician. And the pediatrician basically came in and he said, I saw not one bit of, any sort of inkling that this child was going through SA, or, there were no signs that pointed to it, no behavioral changes. And he said, and if I had seen that, I am honor bound and legally bound to, put this out. There was a leaking story that, John Ramsey had pictures of JonBenet on his desk, but they weren't the loving pictures of a father and daughter, taken at JCPenney's with a matching sweatshirt. We have all been there. No, these were pictures of her and her pageant stuff. It's an obvious and complete and total sign that he is SAing her, because he didn't have what they considered to be the right kind of pictures of his daughter on her desk. And that was totally a sign that there were sinister intentions. There was darkness behind the Ramsey family, and we all knew it. So we come back to Michael Tracy, the professor, who then states that there was another overwhelming theory that if her parents had put her into pageants, it was kind of like she was already sexualized. And, John Ramsey's the dad, therefore, he's approving of this. And by the transitive property, as told to us in, algebra, which I still didn't pass, John Ramsey ipso facto is a PDF file, because we're all experts in this. And I'm like, I watch true crime, and even I didn't make that leap of logic. But Pamela Woodward interviewed JonBenet Ramsey's pediatrician, and he emphatically and categorically denied that there was any sign of past SA or historic trauma or anything of the sort. It also was brought up that if he had lied about that, if he had not told anyone about this, he would have lost his medical license. He said that in his words and his observations, she was a very much loved child, and her family loved her. Now, the tabloids were critical at putting this, essay note into the narrative, and we just see piles and piles of the, daddy touched me. Like, you remember the gross headlines that were, that you would check out as your mom's trying to check out, and you're like, oh, I didn't know Bat Boy got into Harvard. I'm going to have to send him a congratulation note. So these were completely, just a bunch of headlines, Beauty Queen's Nightmare Life of S.A., just anything that would sell. It wasn't true. It was unfounded, but it was a good story and it would sell. Little Beauty Queen abused for months before she was unalived from the Globe. Michael Tracy contends that one of the biggest issues and barriers in this case was the media's role in inflaming false leads and the police colluding with journalists to try to, pressure the Ramseys. Professor Michael Tracy's work involved a lot of the, decline of journalistic values, and he kind of focused on this coverage of JonBenet, and he said it was he couldn't ask for a better example of the decline of, media integrity, journalistic integrity, following up on sources, making sure that a story was true before you ran on it. So he had the very first documentary about the JonBenet murder called Who Killed JonBenet? This was, played on British television. And he actually interviewed the Ramseys. He's like, you know what? I want to get to the bottom of this. So he reached out to the public relations people that were covering things for the Ramseys. And he honestly didn't think he was going to get any sort of attention from them because they were being pretty guarded with the media, obviously. And states, that he was able to get, I think what he said was 5 days, 6 hours during each of those 5 days, where he interviewed both Patsy and John together and then by themselves. And, it does come to light that the voices or the Patsy's part in this, all the things that we were kind of getting from Patsy as she is, maybe functioning a little bit better, looks a little bit more contemporaneous. This is all come from his archival footage. So this is all things that he's asked him. And now I wrote down, now I do feel that this docuseries does want me to feel a certain way. It seems from all of his talk prior to this revelation in this episode, Michael Tracy does not believe that the Ramseys were involved in this. Now, this is just my opinion, and maybe I'll be wrong as the episode goes along. Maybe we'll get something more for the skeptic, or the they did it. Michael Tracy states that it was a fascinating experience, and we get to see those interview with the Ramseys. And we go to a clip asking whether JonBenet was, SA'd. And you can just see, so John is really hard for me to read. And welcome, Baker Raiders. I hope you guys are all, I think I ate my weight in stuffing. So my stomach is like, no more stuffing, no more food ever. But so when Michael Tracy asks, did you guys assault or, abuse JonBenet? I will say that John has been the hardest one for me to read. He has kind of a general aloofness to his face. You can tell, well, Baker, if I didn't say it, who else would? He definitely has more of a poker face, but you can tell Patsy, she almost does this, it's like a snarl that how dare someone accuse us of doing this to our daughter. And it snowballs, It's just such a weird thing to see her have this kind of really emotional, but it's not emotional in like, how dare they, this, that, and the other. It's just that, like, ew, just this disgust and disdain she has for anyone who would put out this story. The next person to come in the champion of weird stories, unrelated, and media predation on a tragedy comes when a former Miss USA steps in, uninvited, unasked, with her own story of childhood abuse and incest in her family and, all this terrible things that's happened to her. But this woman named Marlene, I think it's Van Buren, states kind of came out of left field. So she kind of got attention because she used to be a beauty queen and her father was unfortunately disgusting with her. But she came in and she was invited by the Colorado Police Department to give her story about how this can look, how, a perfect family on the outside can be hiding a monster. They wanted to get, this woman who, again, is in no way related to this case. The police thought it was very important to get her testimony, to make her insert, herself and her personal trauma in an unrelated murder case. But they definitely, wanted to make sure that it was going to get in there. And they made a big deal about showing, her coming in, giving her testimony. She did the media tours, explaining all of this. And she could for sure tell, just from watching JonBenet on those videos, that she had been abused, that she was crying out for help. And just, doggone it, I'm an expert. But sure, Boulder Police, I'm sure that you would find this a fruitful way to go, since you delete this without investigating or interviewing, a pediatrician of the child you claim was chronically SA'd. John then cuts in saying he wouldn't recognize this former beauty queen if she walked in the door. Like, he has no idea who this person is. And again, she just kind of gives her story, which is sad. I'm not going to lie. I mean, being forced to perform in beauty pageants while your father is, abusing you behind closed doors, I wouldn't want that on anyone. But this does not make her an expert in, an unalived child beauty queen with possible SA, maybe. So the fact that she could be considered both an expert in child abuse and pageants is a bit farcical. And again, the media, in their gross and disgusting way, went so far as to bring up John's first unalived daughter. And we get to see headlines like daughter's secret pain, the abuse shared between sisters, or older sister died protecting younger sister. Just absolutely gross. We see pictures of, John's daughter who passed away in a car accident, and they're linking it to JonBenet Ramsey. And as I have said multiple times, but you just don't hate the media enough, because they were willing to go into this man, losing his daughter, and then stating that she was also a victim of abuse, and that's why she died. Now we cut back to Professor Matthew Tracy talking about the first documentary, and that they did look at it and, look for evidence of SA. He said, as a producer, I wanted to look at every theory in the case, and we didn't find anything. We cut to John Ramsey's surviving daughter, Melinda Ramsey, talking about her father, and her voice is really breaking. She's like, you see all these things on the tabloids and all of these things on the media, but you didn't live and you didn't grow up with my father. And you didn't grow up. Yes, so he had 3 children from a first marriage, 2 daughters and 1 son. And unfortunately, I think his daughter, Beth, passed away in a car accident. And then Melinda was his other daughter. And then he has a son named John from his first marriage. So now I think Melinda kind of stays out of the limelight. She wasn't really very keen on being in front of the camera. You kind of saw her in profile as she's walking her dog and things like that. So this might be something that she's not felt comfortable with coming forward with, or, being on camera. But she wished she could say something to convince, the tabloid rags and media. She's like, I could say that I grew up with my father and my father would never do that. But how am I going to convince, the people that are selling these things as you're, in the candy aisle, basically figuring out if you're going to buy another Snickers bar or not? Now, we then it's kind of jarring the way that this documentary tends to go from point to point to point. You're still moving forward chronologically, but you're getting so many different points of views. We are now treated to another part of the deposition in which Detective Steve is asked, are you looking for any sort of pathologies or scandals or behaviors in the past of the Ramseys? And the detective says, yes, but then he's like, what do you mean pathologies? So then the lawyer, doing that lawyer sarcasm that only lawyers can do, and he's like, like drug abuse, physical domestic violence, those would be pathologies, behaviors. Did you find any of that? And Detective Steve has to, admit that they really didn't find anything. There were no skeletons in the closets as much as they were looking into the Ramseys. They did not find anything. And let me let this cat out of here before she gets all Twitter-pated. I'm out. So it is very interesting how the Boulder police, they have their blinders on and they are leaking out these stories to try to smoke out the family. All the time that they've been doing this, they have the DNA test results, realizing that there is absolutely nothing in this DNA that links the Ramseys to the unknown DNA under JonBenet's fingernails and in her private area. Now, again, Detective Steve dances around, hems and haws, and states, I don't think, to my understanding, nothing remarkable or outstanding insofar as you're inquiring about. So really, I wanted to take note of, especially after the YSL trial, after the Delphi trial, how much the media and certain police departments can seem to work together to maybe look like maybe this story's almost okay, but I need you to shade it this way. And it really is interesting. And when there's not enough to convict, or we sure can convict in the court of public opinion, can't we? Now, according to the police, there was no history of child, grossness or domestic violence or substance abuse, anything. And they're going through the Ramseys back, history logs with a fine-tooth comb. The detective replies that drug abuse, child abuse, spousal abuse, nope, didn't really find anything that I'm aware of. John comes back on in a voiceover talking about being prosecuted in the court of public opinion, and we just get all of the tabloids. They did a Gallup poll, and 70% of people polled felt that the family had unalived JonBenet. Now, Paula Woodward comes back to do a voiceover, and in the background, all you see are just these horrible headlines. Patsy, the evil mom who's reliving her glory days through JonBenet. JonBenet, her secret torment. And she states quite rightly that the Ramseys were hated. They were public enemy number one because the information that leaked from the police that, got in these little stories were just shaded that way. They wanted everyone to think, the Ramseys are totally guilty and we'll figure out a way to prove it. But they wanted the Ramseys to have not 1 minute of peace. John talks about being followed by the media everywhere. They were hounded. They would stay at a friend's house. And then, after a couple hours, their friend's house would be surrounded by, all the media vans that just trying to be a part of his life. It was completely difficult that he and Patsy just kind of, walled into themselves. And it wasn't until they, started really focusing on the 3 children they still had around that they started wanting to live and interact and engage with the world again. John and Patsy decided that their their kids had already lost so much in their lives, and they couldn't afford to let them lose their parents as well. And we do get to see, some more family videos and family pictures. We got to see a lot of, videos of Burke being kind of, just a goofy little kid. And John talks about how Burke and JonBenet were really close as siblings. That, how do they contextualize this for Bert? Or Burke, not Bert. How do they make this okay when, you lose your best friend? And we cut to this really poignant scene with Patsy explaining to Burke, when they would have to cover their heads with the jackets and everything, that, some people don't know what they're talking about and they don't know you. And, that's fine. And as they were getting to the cash or the checkout register, there were just stacks and stacks of tabloids saying, monster in their midst, JonBenet's brother did it, that kind of sort of thing. And how she had to explain to this little boy that, unfortunately, some people don't always tell the truth. And just because they're in the media doesn't mean they have to tell the truth. And people can tell really ugly stories. And she said, but you can't act like, you don't see them. Now, this is where we get to hear from John's other son, John Andrew Ramsey, stating that, around this time, Burke was 9 years old. And how do you explain to him that half the country thinks that you unalived your sibling? He said, it's absolutely absurd. He says this with a straight face. Again, he is a very subdued kind of face, but he was very open toward the camera. He looked right into the camera. And so I didn't see it more as like he doesn't have feelings. It was just more like, how do you explain this to a 9-year-old? Kind of like what I'm telling you now. But you can tell he's earnest, and it seems like he's very, very grounded in this sort of, it wasn't him, I don't know what's going on, but you can definitely tell he is being earnest and truthful. Now we jump forward chronologically to February 13th, 1997, 7 weeks after the murder. The media press release room is full, like beyond full. Like there is like overflow room. People are standing up, mullets just everywhere. 1996. I'm pretty sure I actually saw a rat tail too. But we have got a room just full of these media vultures, journalists. And we get, an official coming out to the mic saying, I want to make something clear. The suspect list is narrowing down. But, there's no one that I can give you straight off. Now, Julie McKinley states that, that's when law enforcement, they would talk and they would kind of give you some stuff. They gave every indication that we were just about to get an indictment. Like that's kind of how it was relayed to them. Like, look, not today, but within the next week, we are going to get an indictment. The Ramseys are going down. They talked a mean game, the complicating factors, everyone thinking the Ramseys did it. We were just waiting for that one little piece of evidence that would have given the DA a chance to run with it. Now, so what they were not thinking, as in a common theory, that Burke did it and the parents found out and they both worked in concert to make it appear as if this was a kidnapping. So we go back to the deposition and the lawyer is asking, at what point in time did you say, I think Patsy Ramsey unalived her daughter? And that detective responds that there wasn't a defining moment when this idea just come to him, but that somewhere on or about, 1997, it became more apparent to him that there was abundant evidence leading back to Patsy Ramsey. John St. Augustine, the FBI agent that we met in the first episode, who had stated that the ransom note didn't really cut muster with him, stated that the police had come up with this theory because they figured it was probably Patsy. JonBenet had wet the bed. Patsy Ramsey, either in just a fit of tiredness or upsetness. Because here's the problem. We don't know what came first, the garrote or the hit on the head. Now, or somewhere in concert. So Patsy Ramsey, having discovered that JonBenet has again wet the bed, took her into the restroom. A scuffle ensued. She pushed her head either hit on the back of like the bathtub or the toilet or the sink. And then she took her downstairs, did the garrote, maybe she thought she was already dead, then realized she was still breathing. And instead of getting help for her child, just decided to, make up this total ransom thing. Now we cut back to the deposition, to get it that this is, in fact, this detective's own hypothesis. This is what he's decided. He's like, look, Patsy was turning, she was fixing to turn 40. She was losing her looks, as all you women's do. All you women's lose your looks at 40. You were exhausted from Christmas Day, and she got into an argument, and she just wouldn't be the first mother to lose control. And one of the doctors that the police had consulted stated that toileting issues can be a common cause for child abuse, according to some therapists. And, that it's a major cause of parental rage. And that there was some sort of explosive encounter in the child's bathroom sometime prior to 1 a.m. And that JonBenet, basically JonBenet did something. It was 1 a.m. Patsy had to hide her, find her, write down her ransom note. She was going to move the body, but she just ran out of time. So this is the, Detective Steve Thomas figures out who done did it. And he said that, that was his hypothesis. She took the next step. She, cleaned things up. She used her own paintbrush and the garrote, that. And then Bob Whitten comes on to state that this theory completely ignores evidence, because we know that JonBenet Ramsey was alive when she was being tortured in the moments before her death. She had petechial hemorrhaging, which doesn't happen if you're already dead. So if Patsy had already struck her head and she was dying, why add the garrote? Why choke her with the garrote? That makes no sense. You wouldn't need to. She's already dead. So Bob Whitten's asking some question. So if you believe that Patsy Ramsey, did these things, and she would have had to do all of these things when JonBenet was still alive. So this wasn't, staging according to him. JonBenet was alive. You were torturing her, trying to get her to be compliant. And then we go back to the deposition where the attorney asks, okay, did all of the experts agree that JonBenet was alive during the injury to her private area? And Detective Steve didn't know which experts he was talking about. Detective Steve comes up with a lot of amnesia when he's being asked questions. But the lawyer explains, the signs that she was maybe molested, did that happen when she was still alive? And the detective continues to play dumb. But then, finally admitted, yes, I think she could have been alive during this trauma. And the detective brings up, the real practical problem, that if Patsy's holding the garrote and choking JonBenet, then how in the hell is she also inflicting the trauma with the, broken brush? And he's like, look, I was making a hypothesis. I haven't gotten this quite figured out yet. The lawyer asks, do you still believe that the garrote was placed there by Patsy Ramsey to stage a scene? And the detective states that he offered a hypothetical hypothesis that was consistent with the evidence as he knew it. Gosh, the weasel words possibly, could not be louder. John makes a voiceover where he states that all of his kids, and all kids, at certain ages, wet the bed. It's part of being little. It's no big deal. It's part of being kids. And he talks about how Patsy had just beat stage 4 ovarian cancer, that in his opinion, she would have been fine if JonBenet had wet her bed. It wasn't anything that she hadn't dealt with before. It wasn't anything he hadn't dealt with. If she was upset, then he would have gone in and dealt with that. But I want you to keep this bedwetting theory in mind, because we are going to be introduced to someone else that's going to also question this case. We jump to March 13th, 1997, 2.5 months after the murder, and the media is still, just fanning the flames of this case. And we have, shocking news in the media release that apparently Boulder prosecutor has been kept out of the loop on this investigation. And we learn that there was a little bit of a turf war. There was a Jets and Sharks thing going on. Because according to the police department, the Ramseys done did it. And we just needed to all figure out the evidence to prove this. But according to the DA, his investigators, access to just about the same things, they were thinking maybe an intruder did it. So you had cops and the DA's office fighting for seniority over this case. And basically the cops did not tell the DA that the DNA evidence was back from CBI. Yes, you heard that right. The Boulder police did not tell the Boulder District Attorney's Office that the DNA was back, showing an unknown man. And we are introduced to Alex Hunter. Now, he is one of the DAs, in fact, the main DA, talking about how some in the Boulder Police Department thought that they knew who did it, and the district attorney and the police argued about that. And by the spring of 1997, it was almost an untenable relationship. Alex Hunter, the DA, could barely work with the police. So Alex Hunter goes and he talks to Lou Smith. And we are going to get a lot of Lou Smith's tape recordings. But he was a decorated homicide detective. And Alex Hunter basically said to him, Lou, could you come out of retirement? Could you look at this case? Because I can't get anyone to see the same thing. And we're introduced to Lou Smith, listening to him where he gives his he's making a tape recording and he's talking about starting on this case. And he's on his way to Boulder to talk with Alex Hunter, who's the district attorney. And he felt very strongly that the killer of JonBenet Ramsey should be caught and made to pay for what he had done to this little girl, whether it be the parents, whether it be the brother, whoever it may be. And we're introduced to Kurt Pillard. He's the investigative commander of Colorado's police department, who got involved under Lou Smith's direction. He's like, Kurt, I need, someone I can trust. And oh, I haven't seen someone with Mo too, but that's cool. I love that I get sidetracked. But basically, Kurt got pulled into this detective being under Smith. And, Kurt is just talking about, Lou is like the cop you'd want to have around. He is the Detective Joe Kenda we all want. And, he had investigated over 150 homicides. So you've got Lieutenant Dan over here, who's not nary a homicide in homicidery. And then you've got, Lou Smith. He did not. As you get further into this, he definitely has more interest in the intruder theory. He is the one that kind of brought up this idea of an intruder coming in earlier in the evening, taking all the time to familiarize himself with the house while the Ramseys were gone, and then not enacting any violence until they'd gotten back. So he kind of is sort of brought in as this Elliot Ness figure, this, guy who's going to come in and clean up this town and find this monster. He was even, they talked about a case of a little girl being kidnapped, taken from her home, and he was able to find the single fingerprint of the suspect and close this case. We go back to Smith talking about how many times things are what they seem. So not things aren't what they seem, but things are in fact exactly what you see. And he said, he basically states, look, I'm not saying that this is a kidnapping or a botched plan, maybe a related family member in some way, but I am saying that things just don't feel good about this as far as this being completely the family, in his own words. And he states that, from what he's seen, JonBenet was deeply loved by her family, regardless of what you feel about the beauty stuff. He, in his estimation, this was a normal family. And that she meant something to the world, and that he really just hoped, and you could kind of see this really, humble, I just want to do a good job and get justice for this little girl and this family. And I was like, flippin' legend. Could we possibly get this officer, this paragon of policing, to solve this damn case? Honestly, he feels like the old gunslinger that comes back because the town is corrupt and has forgotten how to crime. And unfortunately, he wanted to stay out of it, but he's going to have to come back and, clean up this town. So we're also introduced to John St. Augustine. He's a retired commander of the sheriff's office in El Paso County. He said, Lou asked me to come along with him and Kurt, and I was like, yes, let's get this done. And he was basically going to follow Lou and where Lou said that this case was going. So we get a, more just of him. I guess Lou liked to record himself on, video cassette. So we get a lot of him kind of cutting in through these things. And the first sort of new idea or new thought that Lou brings in is that there were on JonBenet's head or face and her back, there were two kind of pinpoint marks that were equidistant from each other. And the Colorado police said that that was, those probably came from train tracks and things like that. That, it was, oh, well, I don't know. I'm just telling you, I haven't looked into all these people. But if he did get arrested for that, then it's something I'll look into and put in this too. But he posited that those marks were in fact stun gun marks. And he was able to kind of hone in on this possibly being marks made by an air taser. And he tested this taser on pig carcasses because, pigs and their skin tend to react sort of the same way that humans do. Now, it's interesting because this has never been either borne out or not borne out. I don't know that there was any further investigation on this point as to whether these marks more fully aligned with train tracks that were part of the train room. Burke had a big train track set, or if this was actually found out to be a taser. But another thing Lou would like you to really remember. Now, remember that theory that we had just talked about Patsy being enraged, like just freaking enraged. JonBenet had wet the bed again. And so Lou looks at the pictures because they took pictures of JonBenet's room. And we find that there was trace evidence on the sheets. Now, according to Lou, it looks like JonBenet was picked up, and then you know how you pick up a kid, and if you pull them back, it kind of brings all of their bedding back with them towards the foot of the bed. It looked exactly like what had happened. Someone stood at the foot of, or the side and foot of the bed, picked up JonBenet, brought her either to his chest or something like that, but someone got her out of the bed. And what you don't notice on these sheets? A urine stain. Not to mention, they had trace evidence in them, meaning that this wouldn't have been a new, fresh sheet. If you got a fresh sheet, say out of the linen closet, it probably would not have been imbued with as much trace evidence. And he thought it odd. He had always thought it odd, as he was trying to find out a way to make this make sense, why JonBenet didn't scream or struggle if she was taken out of the bed, either, by herself or by a family member. And that is where he starts going on this, okay, if there was an intruder that had waited, and we find out that the cord that was put around JonBenet's arms and was actually found in a sort of guest room right off of JonBenet's room. So there was a guest room, and it had a coil of this rope. Now, take it with a grain of salt, but the Ramseys have never claimed that they brought any of this rope into their house. They've never, claimed ownership on it. They've we don't know how it got there. But I do find it, if we're going to give this idea any sort of validity, if you had been able to stay in the house, familiarize yourself with it, and you wanted a little girl, which there might have been other cases that are sort of like this, as we go further into let's see, I'm sorry. So, where would you set all these things up? And I would think right by the room. And if you have a way to keep her quiet and knock her out, she was just an itter bitter thing. I don't know what a stun gun would do to a teeny tiny child, but I could imagine it would at least knock them unconscious. Now, he stated that, if she was tased and, tied up, taken out of her room, they would make very little noise. And if you'd already familiarized yourself with the layout of the house, that would be one way of doing these things. Now, Julie Hillard is one of the Leaky Leach journalistic class who talked about how her police sources never put much importance on the stun gun or, whether one was used or not. She's like, look, according to the sources that leaked me all of my stories, they didn't say anything about a stun gun. So take that with whatever grain of salt you want to. Now, another voiceover comes on stating that the Boulder PD, states that the two marks on her face were created by laying on a train track. We jump back to pictures of Burke's sort of train room. So they're claiming that the end spokes that would, how when you have like an electric train set and you connect the two train sets together, she said that she might have gotten those from laying on a train track set. So they already went out of their way to sort of poo-poo the, stun gun marks. They were totally not stun guns. And so, Lou says, I know when I see stun gun marks what they are. And Kurt comes in and tries to kind of say, when we were sitting around, Lou would always get hung up on the stun gun. And, that if you want to keep, a child subdued and you're her parents, why do you need a stun gun? You only need a stun gun if you're, someone strange, a person that wouldn't be able to immediately calm JonBenet Ramsey. So then it just kind of says, he goes on to explain what he finds wrong with the early morning picture of JonBenet's room. The fact that the sheet didn't show any urine on it, it wasn't wet, there was still fibers, and things like that. So he definitely does have reasoning behind everything that he is noticing. Now, you don't have to agree with them. I mean, at this point, I don't agree with anyone except that the media sucks and I hate Geraldo. Now, Lou Smith decides, being older and curmudgeonly, decides to throw some big old shade at Detective Steve, saying there's another thing that Steve Thomas says, Patsy Ramsey came in and that JonBenet wet the bed. You'll notice that the bed's not wet. The bedding's not wet. And then we bounce back to the deposition. Now, Detective Steve is asked by the lawyers, well, were the sheets wet? And Detective Steve's like, oh, I don't know. Look, I wasn't even there. And the lawyer says, wait a minute. You're the lead detective and you didn't ask your police officers whether those sheets were wet? When your main hypothesis is that she died because of abuse resulting after she wet the bed? And he's like, now, I mean, this was a hypothetical situations, based on all of my quote unquote evidence and that kind of thing. And I mean, but no. So then Lou Schmidt goes on to further investigate this particular piece of evidence, going into the fact that those sheets were full of trace evidence, fibers and other things that came from the PJs. And typically you would not see that much fiber load kind of trace evidence if those were fresh sheets just put on that bed that evening, especially we know that JonBenet didn't spend a whole lot of time in her bedroom after that. He also brings up the small guest room right next to JonBenet's room and how there was rope found in that guest room, the same style and type of rope that was used to tie her hands and make the garrote. And it wasn't, according to the Ramseys, this has never been supplied by them. So, we get that dun 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 music. And Lou Smith, states that there's a possibility that an intruder could have brought it in with him to use it as binding. And Carol McKinney states that when Lou Smith was brought in, people were hopeful that this would bring the case to an end. That, but then police started realizing that Lou Smith wasn't agreeing with them, that the Ramseys were all the guilty. This is not what they thought that, was the truth of this crime. They started calling him a delusional old man. They, kind of leaked media stories that he was a bumbling kind of guy who should never have been brought into this case. He was a has-been who's has-been, and, he was, if he wasn't a bumbling incompetent, then he was just trying to make a name for himself. He really wasn't here to solve the case. He was just here to give you all the conspiracy theories. We get a voiceover from Lou Smith's former colleague stating that he was, far from a delusional man. He was the type of detective that you'd want on your case. We cut back more of Lou on the tape recorder talking about, going to bed fairly late that night, tossing and turning, feeling that the investigation was going down a wrong track. The open window in the basement really bothered him because, that was where the body was found. And possibly not something I had realized until I watched this, but I'm sure it was probably out there for a long time. On the top of the suitcase that was under the window in the basement was a small piece of glass and a couple of small pieces of vegetation, maybe grass or something else. And he states, my mind would just keep coming back to that suitcase and that little piece of glass. And it really it bothered him because, that's where he believed that the killer entered. And then we cut to a media interview with Detective Steve Thomas being asked about the window theory and basically rolling his eyes and kind of saying, you guys know I can't talk to you about this. We come back to a graphic of the house, so that kind of explaining how the house was, organized into levels. And it brings us back to the window. And those little pieces of vegetation seem to make more sense. When you look, there's an iron grate kind of over the well of the windows, forming the basement windows. And that grate has little bits of grass and little grass that kind of grow in and around the grate. And according to Lou, that morning the grate was closed down, trapping some of the grass in between the grate and the concrete. And he states that probably would not have happened unless someone had jostled the grate and put it back on. That you wouldn't generally get, grass being put between the grate and the concrete unless you had managed to kind of pinch some grass in this metal grate area. And then we get and this has to be the most hilarious thing, because we get tons of media. No one can go in and out of that window. This is, it's all bunk. You can't get in the window. The window intruder theory is bunk. You see Lou Smith. Now, Lou Smith is about, I think, 67 years if he is a day old at this time. And you get to see him going in and out of this basement through the window. It's in fact very possible. You have to be coordinated, which I am not too chunky or fluffy, but this is possible. And you're, able to see how a man at 66 years of age proved it was possible and an effective way to get in and out of the house. Now, to this date, we've not heard or seen any more evidence about the, little traces of grass or vegetation and the glass bit that was found on top of the suitcase. Now, Lou Smith stated that, who would go into a house where the parents are and wait for the parents to go to sleep? And it would take a really special kind of monster to do that. John Ramsey comes back and says that, he is of the opinion that whoever came in and hurt JonBenet were there when they left to go have dinner at a friend's house. So they left maybe 6ish, 6:30, came back around 9:30, and John Ramsey believes that the killer was in the house the entire time. That he waited until everyone was asleep, and then they're not quite sure what happened, but that's where he decided. Now, as you start to think that this might be the most far-fetched thing that you could ever imagine, I mean, what kind of intruder is going to break in and wait till the family's asleep and then attack someone? We are introduced to a local story in the newspaper being highlighted, reporting an intruder stabbing a sleeping woman. Bob Whitson, the original lead detective, talks about, it's important that there were cases in and around the Boulder area where suspects would go into the residence in the middle of the night and either attempt SA or completed SAs before and after the Ramsey case. Charlie Brennan, the, Leaky McLeacher Snitcherton, comes back and states that in September of 1997, about 9 months after JonBenet's case, there was an incident in another nice neighborhood in Boulder, not that far from the Ramsey's home, where a little girl was assaulted in her home. Her mom, everyone was asleep, and her mom kind of wakes up to a weird shuffling sound, and she couldn't quite, figure out what was going on. And just to check, kind of put her mind at ease, she comes out and she sees her daughter being SA'd or assaulted by some rando stranger, and he runs off. She's able to protect her child. Now, the father at this time was gone away out of town on business. And we cut back to a blacked out kind of interview of the father. And this father states that he feels very clearly that, this intruder broke in when they were not home. He hid inside the home until, everyone was basically asleep, and then decided to do what he was going to do. One of the detectives working with, Lou Smith comes in stating that sometime in the late hours, the mom heard a noise. She grabbed pepper spray, went down the hall, and there was in fact an intruder in her daughter's bedroom preparing to do grossness to the child. And she, chased him out, sprayed him with pepper spray, hell yeah, and that person has never been identified. It also came to light that that girl attended the same dance studio as JonBenet Ramsey. Now, is that a connection? I mean, does this have anything to do with the other case? I don't know, but I do know if I were a detective looking at, let's just say outlandishly, that JonBenet could have been, touched by an intruder, I am going to find it very, very interesting that, there was another case and several cases of attempted late night, either SAs or assaults that, might have happened in the time around that. Then we get another talk from John stating that this case, that John had asked the cops about this. He, in fact, brought this case to their attention. And the police, according to John, stated to them that this case was nothing like his daughter's case because his daughter died and this child lived. Apart from being unfeeling douchebags, I may be a blonde here, but I see some similarities. Now, John states that if he were a novice detective, he would notice the similarity. And we come back to Charlie Brennan, who again stated that their conclusion, of these cases where they were not related in any way, and the Ramseys totally did it. We jump to December 26, 1997. 1 year after the murder, and we're at a candlelight vigil, a bunch of people in parkas that are holding their candles, and we just get the ubiquitous media frenzy that happens as we come across these unfortunate, heartbreaking sort of anniversaries. And there's a change in leadership involving the JonBenet Ramsey case, that even though we didn't close the, year with the case solved, we're going to get it done. And this new man in charge, this new, sheriff in town, was Commander Mark Bruckner. And he stated to the media that they were not prepared to arrest anyone in this case, but the net is closing in. He did confirm that both John and Patsy Ramsey remain under that, umbrella of suspiciosity. We come back to Julie McKinney, one of those journalists who leaked all the leaks, and she's there. She's like, we're super serial, gonna fix this. There's starting to be rumblings. There are rumblings and there are murmurings because America, Boulder, Colorado, the rest of us true crimers, people have been served a year of, we are for serial going to get them. We need like one more piece of evidence. Like, look, Cletus just needs to sign, the arrest warrant. We're going to get here. Now, in the year of 1996, the police department spent $128,915. And in just a few months of 1998, they had already spent $51,728. So people were getting a little confused. Like, you keep telling us we're super for serial, gonna get them, and then there's nothing. Thank you for the 5 Mo in the Deep End memberships, and those went to Neat Scholar, just a tad bit off, Tracy Bowser, David E. and Joyful. Thank you so much. Welcome to the Church of Mo. We have dark chocolate and sarcasm, and apparently we may be losing our voice in a little bit, but thank you so much. So we are starting to see that even though the police have been putting out these stories, and even though people are really, really for sure that, the Ramseys did it, there's a bit of a disconnect. Like, every week you guys come out and say, we're closing in on this, we're closing in on the case, we're closing in, and nothing happens. And maybe to add more insult to injury, the prosecutor wanted to lure a fellow lawyer of his, a grand jury specialist, back to Boulder to go after the Ramseys. So that was going to be an additional $60,000, in not even covering anything else, but just getting this grand jury specialist, Michael Caine, lead grand jury, prosecutor. And he was going to take this case from being a quagmire to being something that we could prosecute, And he wanted to kind of bridge the distance between the DA's office and the police department. And right at that time, he was working for the state of Pennsylvania. So this was basically money to get him back into the state and, get a grand jury specialist to get the thing that they would need to get John and Patsy Ramsey. So he was brought back into the fold. He was going to help DA Alex Hunter, impanel a secret, grand jury and investigate the murder. On his first day on the job, he and Alex Hunter basically had the police, they're like, set up, show us all that you've got. Show us what you've got, and I can tell you if this is a case that we can even charge right now. So, Detective Steve and Detective Trejo and decided they They brought all the things. They had all the PowerPoints, and they were like, Patsy Dunn did it. And Michael Caine has to look at all the cops, and he basically tells them, sorry, you guys, there's not a case here yet. Like, you don't have a smoking gun that we can prosecute. And this just enraged the police department to the point where you have such discord going on that the governor of Colorado is like, everyone, my office now. And, the cops wanted a grand jury. The public wanted a grand jury. And Michael Caine was basically, you guys, you do not have a case right now. I swear to God, you don't. Go find some actual evidence. But we don't have, enough to charge someone. But basically, pressure rolls downhill, and it looks like a grand jury we are going to get. And that's what happens. He stated that he was just dealing with the mystification of police as to how they didn't have a tight enough case with all of the things that they had, been done or had done, and all the stories they had leaked. I mean, how can't you charge these people? So we get a timestamp of August 6, 1998, 1 year and 7 months after the murder. And we see Detective Steve Thomas looking good in a suit, walking in like he's really smart, smiling and hamming up for the camera, because he has decided to, as they were trying to figure out whether this case was going to be sent to a grand jury. Well, Detective Steve Thomas has had his feelers hurt. He is both ashamed and enraged, and he has sent in his letter of, resignation. He's like, I will not, sit in a police department with a DA that won't, bring children's murderers to justice. Sure. And, it's interspersed with more. And finally, Governor Romer is like, let's just get this, just put it to a grand jury, see what they say. Alex Hunter is all on board now. And Lou Smith is confused because he's like, do you guys have more evidence that you didn't show to me? Because I thought that we hadn't been clear whether the Ramseys did it. You could prove it. Or, we were going to go with the intruder. And it appears that the letter of resignation of Detective Steve, well, it just lit a fire, and they were going to get their grand jury. And he stated that he had no doubt that the Ramseys would be indicted, especially with the atmosphere in the media, all the leaks, all the lies, all of this. And he stated over and over again that his personal thoughts were, okay, if the police are going to show their theory, I have got to get in front of this, grand jury. I have got to get in front of this. I have got to be able to tell them that as an experienced homicide investigator, there are some things in this case that do not make sense. He's like, I hate being, lied to and kind of being shunted aside in this, investigation. But I hate more that these cops are going to tell this kind of made up story without all the facts to the jury. So we get another timestamp, September 15th, 1998, 1 year, 8 months after the murder. And we get the full-on 3-ring media circus around the courthouse. Police guards are in parking spaces. And now here's where things are a lot different, because we get to see the media tightly zoom in on various members of this grand jury. So the grand jurors are 12, ordinary citizens from Boulder. They apparently were not given the, option of anonymity. They were basically just filmed, and you see footage of them walking from all parts of the, parking lot into the courtroom. And I think, where did I say? So imagine if that had been sort of the standard operating procedure we still had for the Rittenhouse trial, or, the Karen Reed trial. I mean, I can't imagine having court TV, just being able to zoom in on jurors. But, court TV would cock it up as per usual. Now, John Ramsey does come back stating that the grand jury was in progress, and he and Patsy had already made, provisions. If they went to prison, they had Burke's guardianship signed over. They had kind of explained to Burke that they might be going away, because he's like, you can indict a ham sandwich. It's a one-sided argument where only the, state gets to talk. The defense doesn't get a chance to talk during the grand jury thing. So Michael Caine and Bruce Levin are going to be the ones that are going to be talking. And one of the special prosecutor talks about the surreal feeling of being surrounded by cameras. Michael Caine states, how can a person do this? He talks about people who look like they're normal but do the most hideous things. And it's not something that is out of normal in his line of work. He's seen many people that you would never think would be capable of murder because, he was a prosecutor. So John comes in another voiceover stating that his impression of Michael Caine was that he was out to get him just like every other person from the Boulder, Colorado, government. That then they had another person in their camp, Mitchell Morrissey, and he was the prosecution, the state's secret weapon. He was going to explain all of this DNA mumbo jumbo. He was going to explain it. He was there to, to explain it in a way that the jurors could understand, because DNA was fairly new, and, they were going to get things done. Now, we do get some conjecture here. According to the media, John and Pat Ramsey elected not to testify in front of the grand jury. However, John states that he wanted to testify. He and Patsy both wanted to testify, but the, state basically denied their request to testify to the grand jury. And we go on to some of the hypothesized reasons that the state did not want the Ramseys to talk to the grand jury is that the state was aware that they had a fairly weak case and didn't want the Ramseys to charm the juries. We then cut back to another recording of Lou Smits from September 22nd, 1998, and he starts recording that today is an extraordinary day. It was his last official day in the investigation, and he resigned with the choice to take this to a grand jury. Kurt Pillard comes, on and stated that Lou felt so strongly that he would not be part in convicting an innocent couple that he resigned. That's how strongly he felt. But Lou did want to get in front of that grand jury. He's like, I will not let them manufacture consent, just because I didn't get in front of this jury. And y'all, now this made Mo's heart just aflutter with happiness. But one of the jury members had an honest to God rat tail. And I was like, oh my dadongle, is that a rat tail in the public? And a nice one, that had the little rubber bands on it to keep it all, business and such. And in the grand jury. So yes, there was a rat tail in in the wild, and I was so excited. And Michael Caine stated that, he was going to get what he could get done to rat tails. So if you remember, they're like the little Padawan braid from the early 90s. So it's just a long piece of hair that some boys would put on like the very back of their neck, and you could braid it, and it looked all the... Okay, it was never cute, but we definitely thought it was cool back in the day. So Lou Smith was emphatic that he get into, the grand jury, and he wanted to talk to the grand jury. He wanted to be able to present another side of the evidence. Now, we get to see a letter from, grand jury whisperer, lawyer Michael Caine, that said that his request to testify was denied. And even if he should so much as speak about his attempt to try to get in to testify, he could be charged with jury tampering. Where does this sound familiar? Well, sure, we want to do a grand jury, but we don't want all the facts. Now, according to Michael Caine, as of recording this particular episode, he claims that he never, denied Lou Smith's, request to testify. He's like, that never happened, except we see the letter. Lou did not throw that one away. So, state's attorney's gonna state's attorney. Now, it somehow comes out that Lou wants to testify, and maybe Lou pulled some backroom, like bigger, stronger stuff, but the state's prosecutor make a full reversal, and they're like, we never said he couldn't testify. Come on in here and testify. We want you to testify right now. But I saw the letter. He definitely was told not to testify, and if he should make a stink of this, he could be considered, complicit in jury tampering. And Lou Smith comes back over in a voiceover stating he had never been so badly treated. I was called a bumbling idiot, a moron, a conspiracy theorist. He's like, and it struck me about these words. They were my own fellow police officers saying this about me, people I'd worked with for years and years, because I disagreed with, what they were trying to sell the grand jury. And he remembered, being humiliated and turning to Alex Hunter, the DA, who was sitting there, and he said to Alex, there's no way these defendants are going to be indicted on this. And he walks out. That's basically the last time he talked to Alex Hunter, the DA. He's like, okay. And this was, of course, all filmed, Michael Caine went back on to stating that he thought it would be really good for the grand jury to go see the house. So this grand jury got to go see the former Ramsey house, kind of how the layout is all cattywampus and not intuitive. It's an older house that had been built on kind of haphazardly. The prosecution stated that the house was a rabbit warren. But basically, they wanted to prove that a random person couldn't come out on the end of this, off the streets and be able to figure out where JonBenet's room was, where the basement was, all of that stuff, which does make a kind of a point. And we get to see the media. The media is sort of losing their love affair with the Boulder PD. There's still those ride or dies that get the leaked little bits of story that they can put out. But the media is starting to ask questions because they're bringing up, how much is this costing us? we don't have anything. And, why doesn't the DNA match? You know, wouldn't the DNA match if it was the parents? And you start to slowly see more questions being raised. And we cut over to Mitch Morrissey, the, head of DNAology for the state. And he's like, I never thought that the not matching DNA would be a big deal. It was just a small thing. I didn't ever think that it was going to be important. And you realize how anachronistic this is to almost our entire judicial system now. How, unless we have like DNA and CSI and possibly, a bunch of other things, jurors require that now. You almost want like, okay, we've got DNA, we've got this, we've got that, totally the guy. Jurors now want these things. And back then they thought that they would be able to gloss over this, not matching DNA. And I wrote in here, wow, your officers really gave you a roadmap for how to do Delphi. Now, Mitch explains that he's quite shocked that DNA became a big part of this grand jury. Like, with a straight face, he just could not understand why the jury would get stuck up on this. They had given, the state felt that they had given a set of facts that you could solve this case with either ignoring or not letting the different DNA be such a big deal. Like, you could make all of this make sense. Why are people focusing on this? So you do have this dilemma that if the DNA was created by the killer and it was left, then how did the parents do it? And you start getting grumblings from the media. Like, yeah, this doesn't make sense. This really, really doesn't make sense. And Michael Caine says the dilemma couldn't fix itself because it wasn't anyone in the house. Mitch again with a straight face, my guy, you are a comedian. Oh, I remember this. So they were looking at each other and it was like a Three Stooges thing. He's like, did you think that the DNA was going to be a big part of this? I mean, no. And I mean, all that DNA means is that it wasn't someone in the house. And the other one is just like, yeah, that's totally it. Yeah, so it really is. I said, yes, my sweet summer dinguses. That's called investigating. They do talk about the possibility that the DNA on the underpants might have been touch DNA. So they went so far as to try to discredit this DNA test by talking to every single male person that was in line at the underwear manufacturing plant. Like, could you have touched this DNA or touched this underpants? Could you have touched these underpants? They were so, anxious to discredit this DNA by stating that DNA could possibly have been, a factory worker in one of these garment factories. And they did test every single male working at the time of the manufacture of these particular underpants, and none of those people fit that. So, and there is the issue of touch DNA being microscopic in comparison to an actual amount that would be needed at that time in 1996. The amount of DNA you need just to get a profile was much bigger back then, almost a full quarter to, silver dollar size of blood that you would need in order to extract a profile from this. So the possibility that the unknown male DNA is from touch DNA of a random manufacturer or worker that stayed on the underpants through washing, through wearing, but somehow got there. It's just amazing. So, like I said, they did go through and hell bent for leather looking for anyone who this DNA possibly could fit and then making it just coincidental. And this grand jury lasts a year, and the episode ends on a bit of a cliffhanger. We see Alex Hunt, the DNA or the DA, and Michael Caine coming out to tell everyone what the grand jury has said, what they've ruled. Now, obviously, because we live in the future, we do know that the grand jury decided not to convict. And I will have to watch episode 3 and do the notes for that. I don't know. I think that they saw a couple pieces of evidence, the ransom note and Patsy's handwriting being similar, and then they had locked in on this theory, and you couldn't change their mind. I mean, now I do know that there from what John Ramsey is saying and current and contemporaneous articles, Denver or the police department has never sent this unknown DNA profile to, a genealogical DNA place. They have not done really anything else with it since the time they got it in 1997. John Ramsey has been spearheading. He wants this DNA sent out. He wants genealogical, studies done on it. So that would be like, you've got 23andMe. Maybe we can find markers that are similar and try to find a suspect by going through that family line and getting closer to a suspect that way. There have been so many advances in DNA, and yet, as far as we know, at the end of this episode, nothing else has been done with this DNA. Possibly the only, evidence that wasn't contaminated by a shoddy, investigation, or that wasn't maybe contaminated by, well, just the supposition of the detectives and cops that were going about this investigation at first. Would it be so hard if you got tips about someone else doing this, but you totally know it's the parents, so you don't, pass that tip along? I hope that they can find some new evidence with this. I doubt that episode 3, the finale of this, is going to give us, a new avenue that we haven't thought of. I think we're pretty much still down to the 3 main theories. The parents did it, Burke did it, or an intruder did it. But I hope that getting some more of this, more eyes and attention on this, give public outcry means that I bet the police department would send this DNA off. But I also found it really interesting to kind of my eyes being opened up that the media has always been has always been corrupt, has always worked with police to get out, their shaded ideas and theories. So I guess I'm no longer black-pilled about the media being bad. The media has always been bad. It didn't just become bad. It's just always been suck out loud, terrible. So it was interesting going back and remembering kind of some of these stories and these theories coming out and realizing the true origin and how the more things stay the same, the more things change, the more things stay the same. Media is still going to media, and police, when they don't have a really good case, they're still just going to, put out whatever they can and spaghetti hitting the wall. So thank you guys so much. I will be probably watching episode 3 tonight and working on notes, and then we will come back on Monday with episode 3 done, and then maybe, hopefully, this new documentary and new interest in some of these older cases. You know, the Menendez case. A lot of these older cases will push the police department forward on some of this. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I am going to go probably take a nap, if I'm honest. So I like never get to take a nap, and everyone is at home. No one needs anything. I might get to take a nap. I'll see you guys. Have a great day, and thank you so much for joining me. Bye, guys.